My name is Olivia Rodriguez, and my thesis mentor is the amazing Dr. Riegel. And our study is called A Sign of Healthy Laziness, Attitudes Towards Sleep, and Correlates of Negative Judgments. Alright, so in order to introduce our research topic, it's really important to understand sleep, health, and culture. So I started this research a year ago, actually, with Dr. Riegel. We've been working on a couple of studies around this topic for a while. And at the beginning, I posed this question to myself. I asked, healthy behaviors are valued by many adults in the US today, but is sleep an exception to this rule? So just looking at sleep and health overall from a more physiological standpoint, we all know that 7 to 8 hours is the standard amount of sleep associated with a healthy lifestyle for adults. I'm sure we've all heard of before. Less sleep can result in lymphatic system dysfunction. If you're unfamiliar with the lymphatic system, this is the network that clears waste and toxins from the central nervous system while you're asleep. So getting less sleep, obviously, is going to lead to lymphatic system dysfunction because you don't have as much time to clear toxins from your brain, right? You don't have enough time to flush all that stuff out. So this brings about a variety of both short and long-term negative effects over time. The most important one, short-term effect of this is stress. So lymphatic dysfunction is linked to stress. It's also really important to look at sleep from a social standpoint, which is what the current study is focusing on. So many adults in the US reported not achieving 7 to 8 hours of sleep. I'm sure we've all experienced nights where we do not get 7 to 8 hours of sleep. And a lot of this is prone to a phenomenon called hustle culture. And this is the phenomenon that describes like the drive to work harder and increasing productivity and output being the #1 priority, right? And we can kind of see this everywhere. Like, we're always wanting to produce more, to be more productive. We always aim to be more productive. And a lot of this can be seen, like this is like glamorized in a weird way sometimes. Like we look at like girl boss culture and all that, being productive and working harder. But this can be a negative thing because it can affect our sleep. This is also really closely tied into one of the variables that we looked at in our experiment called Protestant work ethic. And this is an ideology that refers to how much a person views work as the most important pursuit in life, and leisure time is wasteful. So someone who has a really high endorsement of the Protestant work ethic ideology may view leisure time as a negative thing, and may think that it leads to negative effects, negative impacts. Research also suggests that people tend to moralize effort. And basically what this means is that people, by moralizing effort, people turn effort into like a moral thing. So putting more effort into a certain task seems inherently more moral than putting less effort into it. So just to kind of sum up our introduction here, late nights are worn as a badge of honor in our society, a way of unconsciously or consciously telling everyone, I work harder than you. Coming from competitive environments like being at a university, I'm sure we've all experienced this, talking with your colleagues, your peers, like, oh, I only got X amount of hours of sleep last night. Oh, talking about sleeping less almost as if it's a good thing. So I wanted to measure attitudes towards sleep, whether people believe sleep should be sacrificed, and whether people view sleep as a sign of laziness. And this led us to 2 important research questions. So my present study has 2 components, a correlational component and an experimental component. And we had 2 research questions to go along with these 2 components of our study. So the first one was, how will negative sleep attitudes correlate with endorsement of Protestant work ethic and other factors like work addiction? And then the second research question that I had was, will negative sleep attitudes predict more negative judgments of people who sleep more, and excuses involving more sleep as being less valid than other health-related excuses? Hypotheses that I had corresponding to these 2 research questions were that negative sleep attitudes will correlate positively with endorsement of PWE and work addiction, and that negative sleep attitudes will predict more negative judgments of people who sleep more, and excuses involving more sleep as being less valid than other health-related excuses. Alright, so just to get into a little bit of the methodology of we had 462 adult participants recruited from the Amazon MTurk platform. If you're unfamiliar with the Amazon MTurk platform, it's basically like a survey platform where participants can respond to surveys and get paid in return. So it's kind of like a big survey platform where you can respond to studies and surveys, that sort of thing. We embedded an attention check in our study, and after the attention check, 447 responses were retained. So the data that you're about to see is going to be a result of those 447 responses. The average age of our participants was 39, 42% were female, 56% were male, 0.7% were non-binary or other identity, 72% were white, 11.4% were black, 7% were Asian, and 5.1% were Hispanic or Latinx. Alright, so looking at the design of our study, right? As I mentioned before, our study contained both a correlational and an experimental component. The experimental component was made up of two parts, vignettes and excuse examples, which I'm going to go into in more detail here in a few minutes. And the correlational component utilized Likert scales used to measure sleep attitudes, Protestant work ethic, work addiction, and other factors as well. Okay, so looking at the first part of our experimental component, the vignettes. So participants were instructed to read this vignette and respond to questions about their perceptions of Tom and his work. So I'm going to read this to you guys real quick. Tom is a faculty member of a local college where he teaches biology courses and runs a research lab. Tom is of average height and weight and has brown eyes and short dark hair. He works full-time, takes care of his family, and to accomplish all of this, he regularly sleeps 4, 8, or 10 hours at night. Participants were sorted into 3 groups, and each group read a different version of this, but the only thing that changed was the amount of hours that Tom slept. So they read this vignette, saw how many hours he slept, was embedded into it, and then after reading this, they were asked questions about Tom's work and other aspects. We looked at participants evaluated the following. They evaluated effort, Tom's job difficulty and performance, deserved salary, and other traits. Okay, and then on to the second part of our experimental component, we looked at excuses. So participants were instructed to read these excuses given by a hypothetical student for missing an exam. So these are hypothetical excuses. And then they were asked to evaluate the likelihood of then giving the student a makeup exam after reading these excuses. So we had the person experienced a panic attack and felt so anxious about the exam that they could not enter the classroom. The person worked an overnight shift the night before and overslept, needing sleep. The person got a flat tire on their way to the university. And the person unknowingly had a stomach virus and vomited on the way to the university. So as you can see, 3 of these 4 excuses are health-related and 1 is sleep-related. And we were looking at how these would interact with the likelihood of giving the student a makeup exam based on the participants' responses. Now the correlational component, I mentioned before we utilized a series of scales. The sleep attitude scale I designed myself, and we used it to measure sleep attitudes in our participants. And this scale contained items such as sacrificing sleep is a necessary trade-off to get ahead in life, and willingness to lose sleep shows strength of character. And all of these following scales, participants were asked to indicate the extent to which they agree or disagree with each of these statements. Next, we had the Protestant work ethic scale used to measure Protestant work ethic endorsement in our participants. This scale contained items such as our society would have fewer problems if people had less leisure time, and people who have failed at a job have usually not tried hard enough. Then we have the work addiction scale used to measure work addiction. And this scale contained items such as how often in the last year have you become stressed if you've been prohibited from working? And how often in the last year have you thought of how you could free up more time to work? Alright, so let's look at some data and some results. So for the first part of our experimental component, the vignettes, if you remember the little story with Tom, this corresponds to that. A multiple linear regression was used to model the effects of sleep condition. Remember, participants read either about 4, 8, or a 10-hour sleeper. And sleep attitudes on multiple dependent variables. So our question here was, how was the 4-hour sleeper perceived compared to the 8 and 10-hour sleepers? First, looking at effort, we asked, do people view 4-hour sleepers as putting more effort into their job? And this is just to kind of walk you guys through this graph right here. On the bottom, the x-axis, we have sleep conditions. So remember they read about a 4-hour sleeper, an 8-hour sleeper, or a 10-hour sleeper. Over here on the y-axis, we have effort. And then this little legend up here corresponds to negative sleep attitude, right? So high means a very highly negative sleep attitude, right? Very negative view of sleep. And low corresponds to a low negative sleep attitude. I know it's a double negative, it sounds confusing, but you can just think of it as a more positive attitude towards sleep. So interesting findings here. Across the board, the 4-hour sleeper is viewed as putting more effort into his job. And then we also looked at whether people view 4-hour sleepers as having more difficult jobs. Very, very similar results across the board. The 4-hour sleeper was seen as having a more difficult job. And then do people view 4-hour sleepers as performing better at their jobs? These results were really interesting. So this kind of depended on people's attitude towards sleep, right? It looked like you had people with very negative attitudes towards sleep, high negative attitudes towards sleep, viewed the 4-hour sleepers performing better, while those with more positive attitudes towards sleep viewed the 4-hour sleepers performing worse. And I was kind of thinking about the thought process behind this, like why did this happen? I was like, well, maybe the people with more positive attitudes towards sleep saw the 4-hour sleeper, thought he wasn't sleeping enough, and would be tired at work and perform worse, while people with more negative attitudes towards sleep saw that he was only sleeping 4 hours and assumed he was sacrificing sleep for work. So that's kind of what I had some ideas about the process behind this. Okay, moving on to the experimental component. If anyone is a statistics person here, we used a repeated measures ANOVA to analyze the results here. The likelihood of giving makeup exam did vary by excuse. The sleep excuse was significantly less likely to result in a makeup exam compared to other health-related excuses. And people with more negative attitudes towards sleep were overall less likely to give students a makeup exam than any condition. So very, very similar graph here. On the x-axis down here, we have our different excuses. If you remember, overslept, panic attack, flat tire, stomach virus. And then we have likelihood of giving the makeup exam over on the y-axis, right? And then of course our negative sleep attitude scale. Some interesting trends here were that people with more positive attitudes towards sleep were overall more likely to give the student a makeup exam than the other two conditions, average and high. And that the sleep excuse was still the least likely to receive a makeup exam out of all 4 excuses. Something else interesting that I wanted to point out was that the panic attack excuse and the overslept excuse, the sleep-related excuse, were basically the same, least likely to receive a makeup exam when it comes to the people with extremely negative sleep attitudes. And I thought that might be a good avenue for future research, looking at relationships between like perceptions of mental health and sleep in competitive environments. So I thought that was very interesting too. Last but not least, the correlational component. A more negative attitude towards sleep correlated positively with work addiction, as well as endorsement of the Protestant work ethic ideology. That was a super strong correlation. And just to wrap things up, I think that these results are very applicable to competitive environments, such as work and school. Those were basically represented in each part of our experimental component, right? Work and school. Understanding these sleep attitudes and the factors that contribute to them is essential for improving upon negative and potentially unhealthy perceptions of sleep and judgments of others. So if you hope to improve upon these perceptions of sleep, these unhealthy perceptions of sleep, it's really important to understand what causes these negative sleep attitudes. Future studies, as always, could include a more diverse and a larger sample. We always want more diverse and larger samples, as well as further refinement of the experimental component of the study. I would really like, I had some more ideas about focusing more on salary, as well as looking at different jobs and sectors. It would be really interesting to do a study just from a sample of students and a sample of people in the workforce. That would be really cool. Limitations include wording of some of the experimental component statements, particularly the excuses. I don't want to go back here and show the excuses again, but the sleep excuse right there, the person worked an overnight shift the night before and overslept needing sleep. Looking back at that, the participants may have thought that that might have been the only one that was the hypothetical student's own fault for choosing to work an overnight shift the night before. I was not really specific while writing that statement, and that could be improved upon, and is definitely a limitation of the study. And thank you guys so much for attending my talk. I would like to give a special thanks to the Emma Lou Grant Committee for funding this study, as well as my amazing, epic advisor, Dr. Ringo, helped me so much. I could not have done this without you, who are the statistics queen of the school. But yeah, thank you guys so much. Do you have any questions? Thank you.
Yeah, so you think that your data and trends might change with average of your average age of the participants lower or higher? What would you predict if your average participant or range like 70 age average?
I think it would change greatly. I think we would see different results, right? For example, if we went younger, if we looked at students, even like, if we looked at like university students, undergrads, one of the ideas that I have for future studies was looking at undergraduates versus graduate students, and I think you'd see different results even just between those two groups. So I do think that would affect the data and results. It would be really interesting to do studies of each groups.
How do you think it would affect the trend? Do you have any numbers? Opposite, like, oh, older people may found sleep more or less.
That's really interesting. I hadn't thought of like a professional hypothesis for that yet, like a real one. But I believe my hypothesis as of right now would be that older people would value sleep less because of higher enforcement of concert ethic. And as we saw that correlated to negative sleep attitudes. Thank you, that's a great question.
How do you think the results of the thing? Yeah, it would vary if, I think it was the same talk for the next person, if you would had a different description. If you were described as, let's say, African American, or if you were described as having blonde hair and blue eyes, or being more pretty, or generally attractive, do you think that might change the study?
I think it would too. I couldn't tell you exactly how, again, this is another thing I haven't thought of, but it would be an interesting thing to like kind of tinker with and just see what that would do to the results. We tried to keep this one as vague as possible to kind of control so that sleep was the only variable that people were like, that was changing between the groups, right? So we tried to keep the vignette as vague as possible, just as a control. Anybody else?
I have a similar question. Do you have demographic data for them? So you could look at like gender or how age affects them based on the data you already have?
We do. We did collect demographic data. It is all on our computers. I do not believe we have it on here, but we could draw more correlation tables to look. We have a lot of data. We could solve or find answers and correlations about demographics. It is all on our computers. We're still working on refining this study. This has been a work in progress for a couple years. This is study 2, so yes, there's a lot of different directions we can go with this data and this topic.
So in gender, we definitely look at together some racial diversity to look at too much, although we were telling you just for the sleep attitude scale, the two groups that you can compare, we look pretty different.
Yeah, so you're right. We did have, there was no significant difference between men and women. It looked like the Black participants scored higher on negative sleep attitudes than the white participants. But in general, there was just not enough participants to analyze other group differences, which is why we always need more diverse samples when it comes to research in science. So go participate in studies.
So, do you think that because people that participate in these studies are in demographic that is would in fact kind of like limit most studies in general, because most people that aren't like are in a position where they're probably to study.
Yeah, no, that would definitely be considered like a demographic limitation for sure. I could definitely see that affecting the results, which is why in future studies, ideally, I would love to get like information data from as many different groups as possible. Like I mentioned before, looking at purely students, like we were throwing around ideas for the thesis. We thought about looking at like St. Edward students versus like members of the workforce. We could do like professors or like different sectors, different jobs. It'd be super interesting.
One more question next to what Dan says actually, which is, do you think, I don't know if we really chatted about this that much, like just among students, do you think that they generally don't value sleep, like just sort of saying like sleep, I'll sleep like that, doesn't matter, or do they value sleep?
I feel like students pretend to value sleep, but they actually don't. Like, we're always like, yes, go sleep more. Yes, I'm so glad you got a good night's sleep, but then like, we'll go home and like pull an all-nighter and like, you know what I mean. That's kind of just like the general vibe I get from students, but I don't know if you agree, guys. Yeah.
It also depends on like who you're. So I'm sure the more honest students would be, oh, my grades are kind of the highest priority, so less sleep is fine.
Yeah.
Sleep on those things.
But like, you do kind of get what I'm saying about like the like low-key brag though, right? Like I only slept like 3 hours last night studying for this exam. You see what, yeah.
They also like value sleep without getting enough sleep. So that you get out and do it. You know you should be sleeping, you just don't do it.
For sure. I wonder, do professors do the same thing? Are you guys like,
I sleep like 9 hours a day. I noticed in grad school, that's where grad school, I remember the first talk the professor gave us when we were the incoming cohort was, she hasn't seen a movie in 20 years and she only sleeps 4 hours a night and we need to be all in committed to psych and stuff. And then another professor too, like they would just sort of come out quite a bit and like, oh sorry guys, I only got 4 hours of sleep last night. They said that in like every class and makes a lot. So I feel like it was that sort of got started. I don't know what their intention was when they told us that, but it was just like they were talking about it, sort of in the culture.